of things, and one of the things that everybody should realize, and that is probably the single most important factor, is that any startup company that turns into a substantial company over the years, never lose track of the fact that there was a lot of luck involved in that. So, there are a lot of entrepreneurs, there are a lot of people who are very smart, very hardworking. Very few ever have, the planetary alignment that leads to a tiny little company growing into something substantial. So that requires not only a lot of planning, a lot of hard work, a big team of people who are all dedicated, but it also requires that not only the planets align, but that you get a few galaxies in there aligning too. And that's certainly what happened to us. Our timing was good. Our choice of product categories, books, was a very good choice. And we did a lot of analysis on that to pick that category as the first best category for e-commerce online. But there were no guarantees that that was a good category. At the time we launched this business, it wasn't even crystal clear that the technology would improve fast enough that ordinary people, non-computer people, would even want to bother with this technology. So that was good luck. So there are a whole bunch of things that have to sort of align to make it work. I went to my boss and said to him, I'm going to go do this crazy thing, and I'm going to start this company selling books online. And this is something that I had already been talking to him about in a sort of more general context. But then he said, let's go on a walk. And we went on a 2-hour walk in Central Park in New York City. And the conclusion of that was this, he said, this actually sounds like a really good idea to me. But it sounds like it would be a better idea for somebody who didn't already have a good job. And he convinced me to think about it for 48 hours before making a final decision. And so I went away and was trying to find the right framework in which to make that kind of big decision. And I'd already talked to my wife about this, and she was very supportive and said, look, you can count me in 100%. Whatever you want to do. It's true, she had married this kind of, fairly stable guy in a stable career path, and now he wanted to go do this crazy thing, but she was 100% supportive. So it really was a decision that I had to make for myself. And the framework I found, which made the decision incredibly easy, was what I called, which only a nerd would call, a regret minimization framework. So I wanted to project myself forward to age 80 and say, okay, now I'm looking back on my life. I want to have minimized the number of regrets I have. And I knew that when I was 80, I was not going to regret having tried this. I was not going to regret having wanted, trying to participate in this thing called the internet that I thought was going to be a really big deal. I knew that if I failed, I wouldn't regret that. But I knew the one thing I might regret is not ever having tried. And I knew that that would haunt me every day. And so when I thought about it that way, it was an incredibly easy decision. And I think that's a very good, it's if you can project yourself out to age 80 and sort of think, what will I think at that time? It gets you away from some of the daily pieces of confusion. I left this Wall Street firm in the middle of the year. When you do that, you walk away from your annual bonus. And that's the kind of thing that in the short term can confuse you. But if you think about the long term, then you can really make good life decisions that you won't regret later. Most regrets, by the way, are acts of omission and not commission. I think most people when they're 80 years old, you can do bad things. You can go murder somebody, and that would be bad, and that would be an act of commission that you would regret. But most, everyday, ordinary non-murderers, their big regrets are omissions. Well, that blank sheet of paper stage is one of the hardest stages, and one of the reasons it's hard is because at that stage there's nobody counting on you but yourself. One of the things that is very motivating, today it's easy because we've got millions of customers counting on us, and thousands of investors counting on us, and then thousands of employees all counting on each other. But in that beginning stage, it's really just you. And you can quit any time. Nobody's going to care. And so you set about doing the simple things first. So you want to start a company. Well, the first thing you do is you should write a business plan. And so I did that. I wrote about a 30-page business plan. I wrote a first draft. In fact, I wrote the first draft on the car trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that was that is very helpful. Now, the business plan won't survive its first encounters with reality. It will always be different. The reality will never be the plan. But the discipline of writing the plan forces you to think through some of the issues and to get sort of mentally comfortable in the space. I mean, then you start to understand, if you push on this knob, this will move over here, and so on. And so that's the first step. Tried to get a lot of the little housekeeping details done even before we arrived in Seattle. Called an attorney, actually. I called a friend who lived in Seattle, asked if he recommended an attorney. He said yes, he recommended his divorce lawyer. But that's who we used. It was a general practitioner and a small guy, a sort of small sole practitioner. He incorporated the company. He asked me on the cell phone, what name would you like the company incorporated under? I said, Cadabra, as in abracadabra. And he said, cadaver? And I knew then that was not going to be a good name. So we went ahead and incorporated it under that name. We changed it about 3 months later. I stopped in San Francisco and interviewed vice presidents of engineering, because that was going to be an important long lead time item. We needed to build the technology that would run the store, and found the person who turned out to be the most important person ever in the history of Amazon.com on that trip, a guy named Shel Kappan, who built all of our early systems with help from others, but he really sort of architected them and engineered them and just did a fantastic job. So that, so the initial hiring, writing the business plan, the initial hiring, getting the company incorporated, all these are, they're very, in a way, they're sort of, simple, almost pedestrian tasks, but that's how you start, one step at a time. The first sort of initial startup capital for Amazon.com came primarily from my parents, and they invested a large fraction of their life savings in what became Amazon.com. And that is was a very bold and trusting thing for them to do, because they didn't. My dad's first question was, "What's the internet?" Okay, so he wasn't making a bet on this company or this concept. He was making a bet on his son, as was my mother. So, and I told them that I thought there was a 70% chance that they would lose their whole investment, which was a few $100,000. And they did it anyway. And I thought I was giving myself triple the normal odds, because there's really, if you look at the odds of a startup company succeeding at all, it's only about 10%. Here I was giving myself a 30% chance. Startup companies need early planetary alignment, because there are so many things that can go wrong. And when we launched that store in July of 1995, we were shocked at the customer response. Literally in the first 30 days, we had orders from all 50 states and 45 different countries. And we were woefully unprepared from an operational point of view to handle that kind of volume. And in fact, we quickly expanded. We talked to our landlord, and we expanded into a 2,000 square foot basement warehouse space. It had 6-foot ceilings. One of our 10 employees was 6'2". He went around like this the whole time, and we were doing our day jobs, which might have been computer programming and all the different things that 10 people will do in a little tiny startup company, and then we would spend all afternoon and into the wee hours of the morning packing up the orders and shipping them out. I would drive these things to UPS, and so we'd get the last one, and we'd wait to the last second. I'd get to UPS, and I'd sort of bang on the glass door that was closed, and they always would take pity on me and sort of open up and let us ship things late. We had so many orders that we weren't ready for that we had we had no real organization in our distribution centers at all. In fact, we were packing on our hands and knees on a hard concrete floor. And I remember, just to show you how stupid I can be, my only defense is that it was late. But we were packing these things, everybody in the company, and I had this brainstorm. And as I said to the person next to me, this packing is killing me. My back hurts. This is killing my knees on this hard cement floor. And the person said, yeah, I know what you mean. And I said, you know what we need? This is my brilliant insight. We need knee pads. I was very serious. And this person looked at me like I was the stupidest person they'd ever seen. They're like, I'm working for this person. This is great. And said, what we need is packing tables. And I looked at this person, and I thought that was the smartest idea I'd ever heard. The next day we got packing tables, and I think we doubled our productivity. That early stage, by the way, of Amazon.com, where we were so unprepared, is probably one of the luckiest things that ever happened to us, because it formed a culture of customer service in every department of the company, every single person in the company, because we had to work with our hands so close to the customers, making sure those orders went out, really set up a culture that served us well. And that is our goal, to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And then a second round of fundraising about a year later or so, we raised $1 million, and I had to talk to about 60 different people. This is angel investors, so venture capitalists were totally uninterested. And this was a time, it wasn't like what people think of today. And in 1998 and 1999, you could raise $60 million for an internet idea without a business plan, with a single phone call. It was a very different era. But back in 1995, it was very difficult to raise money. And by the way, it wasn't more difficult than it had been for the previous 20 years to raise money. It just was sort of normally hard. It's supposed to be hard to raise $1 million. So with a lot of hard work, we raised that $1 million from about 20 different angel investors who invested about $50,000 each. And that was the original money that really funded Amazon.com. Once you are looking at the odds in a realistic way, it's very important for entrepreneurs to be realistic. And so if you believe on that first day, while you're writing the business plan, that there's a 70% chance that the whole thing will fail, and then that kind of relieves the pressure of self-doubt. I mean, it's sort of like, I don't have any doubt about whether we're going to fail. That's the likely outcome. And it just is. And to pretend that it's not will lead you to do strange and unnatural things. So and what you do with those early investment dollars, so if you have $300,000 and then you have $1 million, what you do with those early precious capital resources is you go about systematically trying to eliminate risk. So you pick whatever you think the biggest problems are, and you try to eliminate them one at a time. And that's how small companies get a little bit bigger, and then a little bit bigger, and a little bit bigger, until finally, at a certain stage, you reach a transition where the company has more control over its future destiny. And when a company is very tiny, it needs a tremendous amount of not only hard work, but as we talked about earlier, luck. As a company gets bigger, it starts to become a little more stable, where if at a certain point in time, the company has a much bigger influence over its future outcome, it needs a lot less luck, and instead it needs the hard work. And at that point, there's a little bit more pressure, because then if you fail, you have nobody to blame but yourself. I had what I consider to be an idyllic childhood. I mean, I had two parents who loved me incredibly. I also had a tremendous amount of contact with my grandparents, my mom's parents. In fact, I spent all my summers on my grandfather's ranch, not far from where we're sitting right now, not far from San Antonio, and spent 3 months every year from the age of 4 to age of 16 working on the ranch with my grandfather, which was just an incredible experience. You know, ranchers and anybody I think who works in rural areas, they learn how to be very self-reliant, and whether they're farmers, whatever it is they're doing, they have to rely on themselves for a lot of things. My grandfather did sort of all of his own veterinary care on the cattle. We would, you know, repair the D6 Caterpillar bulldozer when it broke, and it had gears this big, you know. We would build cranes to lift the gears out. So, and this is just a very common sort of thing that folks in faraway places do. And I think it was a great experience. I remember the very first occupation I wanted to be when I think I was about 6 years old is archaeologist. And this was even, I would like to point out, it's a point of pride, pre-Indiana Jones. And then I wanted to be an astronaut. And then later, by the time I was in my high school years, I wanted to be a physicist. And then by the time I got to college, I wanted to be a computer programmer. And that's actually what I, you know, studied in school. And that's kind of, you know, what's led me along the path I'm on. I had some family role models, and I had some other people, you know, some sort of historical role models that I really looked at too. So certainly my grandfather was a serious role model for me. I just had spent so much time. I think you learn different things from grandparents than you learn from parents. It's a great. I would encourage anybody to try to spend time not only with their parents but with their grandparents. But I also had two people I always would read about, and were Thomas Edison and Walt Disney. Those were sort of my two, you know, biographical heroes. I've always been interested in inventors and invention, and Edison, of course, just, you know, for a little kid and probably for adults too, I still feel this way at least, is not only the symbol of that, but the actual fact of that, the just incredible inventor. And I've always felt that there's a certain kind of important pioneering that goes on from an inventor like Thomas Edison. And then Disney was a different sort of thing. He also, you know, a real pioneer and an inventor and doing new things. But it seemed to me that he had this incredible capability to create a vision that he could get a large number of people to share. Because the things that Disney invented, like Disneyland, you know, the theme parks and so on, they were such big visions that no single individual, unlike a lot of the things that Edison worked on, no single individual could ever pull them off. And Walt Disney really was able to get a big team of people working in a concerted direction. I was a very nerdy and good student, so I was in the goody-goody class of students, and was always, you know, very working hard, studying, you know, always did my homework on time. I was a good student. I liked school. And the things I got into trouble on were, like, I lost my library privileges one time, which was really, you know, inconvenient for me because I was actually, for laughing, I know you'll never believe this, but laughing too loudly in the library. I've had this laugh all my life. I have no idea where it came from. There was a period where my brother and sister wouldn't go see a movie with me. It was too embarrassing. But no, I was sort of, you know, probably unnaturally on the side of not getting in trouble. I mean, by the time I was in high school, we did some pranks type things, but they were the kind of pranks that at the end of the day, the teachers actually secretly loved, you know. And I remember in 4th grade, we had this wonderful contest, which was, you know, the people in the class, there was some prize, I can't remember what it was, whoever could read the most Newbery Award winners in a year. And I read through. I didn't end up winning. You know, I think I read like 30 Newbery Award winners that year, but somebody else read more. And the standout there is the old classic that I think so many people have read and enjoyed, A Wrinkle in Time. And I just remember loving that book. You know, later, I was always a big fan of science fiction, even from when I was, you know, in elementary school, reading various things, and loved, of course, The Hobbit in Tolkien's trilogy that follows on from that. And this little town where my grandfather lived in the summers, where I spent my time in the summer, had a tiny little Andrew Carnegie style library where all the books had been donated from the local citizens. And I found, this is a very small library, smaller than the room that we're sitting in now, and it had, but it had an extensive science fiction collection, because it just so happened one of the residents of this 3,000 person town had been a science fiction fan and donated their whole collection. And that started a love affair for me with people like Heinlein and Asimov and all the well-known science fiction authors that persist to this day. My math teacher in either 4th or 5th grade, I can't remember, Mrs. McInerney, she had a big influence on me. My calculus teacher in high school, Mr. Moore, he had a big influence on me. Mrs. Delchamps, who taught chemistry in high school, Mrs. Rule, who taught physics. I really, I have been blessed with, conscientious, hardworking, super smart teachers. And I don't know, because I only got to go through school once, so I don't know if, I have a feeling I was lucky. I know there are a lot of hardworking teachers out there, but I seem to have had more than my fair share. I always wanted to please. It was one of the things, and I think one of the things that these teachers who are really, really good do is they recognize that their students, they create that environment where you can be very satisfied by the process of learning that's going on. So it's like anything. If you do something and you find it to be a very satisfying experience, then you want to do more of it. And so the great teachers somehow convey in their very attitude and their words and their actions and everything they do that this is an important thing you're learning. And by doing that, you end up wanting to do more of it and more of it and more of it. And I think that's a real talent that some people have to kind of convey the importance of that and to reflect it back to the students. I was very difficult to punish for my parents, because they would send me to my room, and I was always happy to go to my room because I would just read. So they were quite, if I talked back or did anything that was sort of, you're grounded and you have to stay in your room, that was always fine with me. So I was a big reader. I remember playing lots of games in elementary school, like kick the can and various, tag and all the outdoor games and so on. And I did all those things. I think I had a very kind of, normal sort of, except for my ranch experience, which I think is very unusual for experiencing a great one to have had. I think my experience as a kid was a very normal one. I was 5 and 6 years older than them. So, now that I'm 37 years old, it's like we're of the same generation. When I was 15 and they were 10 and 9, I had no time for them whatsoever. It was they were always like the pesky younger siblings that I was trying to shake off and keep out of my room. And I was constantly booby-trapping the house with various kinds of alarms. And some of them were not just audible sounds, but actually like physical booby traps. I think I occasionally worried my parents that they were going to open the door one day and have 30 pounds of nails drop on their head or something. I was always, our garage was basically, science fair central, and my mom is a saint because she would drive me to Radio Shack, multiple times a day, to the point where she would finally say, "Okay, look, will you please get your parts list straight before we go? I can't handle more than one trip to Radio Shack per day." So there was a lot of that kind of stuff going on in our house. I went to Princeton primarily because I wanted to study physics, and it's such a fantastic place to study physics. And and things went fairly well until I got to quantum mechanics, and there were about 30 people in the class by that point, and it was so hard for me. And I just remember there was a point in this where I realized, I'm never going to be a great physicist. There were 3 or 4 people in the class whose brains were so clearly wired differently to process these highly abstract concepts in so much more. I mean, I was doing well in terms of the grades I was getting, but for me, it was laborious, hard work. And for some of these truly gifted folks, it was awe-inspiring for me to watch them, because in a very easy, almost casual way, they could absorb concepts and solve problems that I would, work 12 hours on. And it was a wonderful thing to behold. At the same time, I had been studying computer science and was really finding that was something where I was drawn to that more and more, and that turned out to be a great thing. So I found one of the great things Princeton taught me is that I'm not smart enough to be a physicist. I was very, very lucky, because in 4th grade, which for me would have been, it would have been about 1974, I had access to a mainframe computer. There were no personal computers in 1974, and there was a company in Houston that had loaned excess mainframe computer time to this little elementary school. And we had a teletype that was connected by an old, acoustic modem. You literally dialed a regular phone and picked up the handset and put it in this little cradle. None of the teachers knew how to operate this computer. Nobody did, but there was a stack of manuals, and me and a couple of other kids stayed after class and learned how to program this thing. And that worked well for maybe about a week. And then we learned that the mainframe programmers in some central location somewhere in Houston had already programmed this computer to play Star Trek. And from that day forward, all we did was play Star Trek. And that's actually something I should have mentioned, but I used a large portion of my elementary school free time hours not only watching Star Trek, the original of course, but also playing Star Trek. And everybody wanted to be, all of my friends, we all wanted to be Spock. And if you couldn't be Spock, then you would be Captain Kirk. And if you couldn't be Captain Kirk, then it started to separate. People wanted to be different. Some people wanted to be Bones. I never wanted to be Bones. I would take as my third choice, if I couldn't get Spock or Kirk, I would take the computer. You say, somebody would ask, the computer was fun to play because people would ask you questions and they say computer and you'd say working. I think it's always hard to know why you're drawn to a particular thing. I think part of it is if you have a facility with that thing, then of course it's satisfying to do it, and so in a way that's self-reinforcing. And certainly I always had a facility with computers. I always got along well with them, and they're such extraordinary tools. I mean, you can teach them to do things, and then they actually do them. I mean, it's a kind of an incredible tool that we've built here in the 20th century. And that was a love affair that really did start in 4th grade. And then by the time I got to high school, I think when I was in 11th grade, I got an Apple II Plus, and continued fooling around with computers. And then by the time I got to Princeton, I was taking all the computer classes, and actually not just learning how to hack, but learning about algorithms and some of the mathematics behind computer science. And it's fascinating. I mean, it's really a very involving and fun subject. I toyed with the idea of starting a company, and even talked to a couple of friends about starting a company, and ultimately decided that it would be smarter to wait and learn a little bit more about business and the way the world works. One of the things that it's very hard to believe when you're 22 or 23 years old is that you don't already know everything. It turns out, as I suspect, people learn more and more as they get older, that you seem to realize that you know less and less every year that goes by. I can only imagine that by the time I'm 70, I will realize I know nothing. So that was, I think, a very good decision to not do that. I went to work for a startup company, but one in New York City that was building a network for helping brokerage firms clear trades. I mean, it's a kind of an obscure thing, and it's not very interesting to go into, but it used my technical skills, and it was very fun work, and I loved the people I was working with. And then from then on, I started working sort of at the intersection of computers and finance, and stayed on Wall Street for a long time. Ultimately worked for a company that did this thing called quantitative hedge fund trading. So what we did is we programmed the computers, and then the computers made stock trades. And that was very interesting too. And that was where I was working when I came across the fact that the web was growing at 2,300% a year, and that's what led to the forming of Amazon.com. I think the internet in general, Amazon.com in particular, this is still chapter 1. So you're sort of asking me about my story, and it's still sort of the very beginning. Which I think is, it is interesting because there's still a lot of this to be built, a lot of technology to build, a lot of innovations for customers to be built, and also the financial side of the story is still playing itself out in real time. But there's a lot of visibility on the internet, and there has been for the last couple of years. The first 4 years of the company, we sort of worked in relative obscurity, and it was we always had lots of supporters, and we always had lots of skeptics, and that's still the same today. It's just that the level of visibility is so much higher. So if you look at the 6 years that we've been doing business so far, one of them, exactly one of those 6 years, we were not the underdog, and that was 1999. And that was the weird year for us. Now it's much more normal. It's more what we're used to. At this point in time, we haven't built a lasting company yet. We still have a tremendous amount of hard work ahead of us. But we have all of the assets in place now. We have eliminated the necessity for the luck that a startup company requires. And now, our future is in our own hands as a team and as a company. We have so many smart people. We have so many customers who treat us so well. And we have the right kind of culture that obsesses over the customer. If there's one reason we have done better than most of our peers in the internet space, over the last 6 years, it is because we have focused like a laser on customer experience, and that really does matter. I think in any business, it certainly matters online, where word of mouth is so very, very powerful. If you make a customer unhappy, they won't tell 5 friends, they'll tell 5,000 friends. So we are at a point now where we have all of the things we need to build an important and lasting company. And if we don't, it will be shame on us. I think in my particular case, I laugh a lot. So it is, there are, I think stress, you can be, I think one of the things that's very important to note about stress is that stress primarily comes from not taking action over something that you can have some control over. So if I find that some particular thing is causing me to have stress, that's a warning flag for me. What it means is there's something that I haven't completely identified, perhaps in my conscious mind, that is bothering me, and I haven't yet taken any action on it. I find as soon as I identify it and make the first phone call or send off the first email message or whatever it is that we're going to do to start to address that situation, even if it's not solved, the mere fact that we're addressing it dramatically reduces any stress that might come from it. So stress comes from ignoring things that you shouldn't be ignoring, I think in large part. So stress doesn't come, people get stress wrong all the time, in my opinion. Stress doesn't come from hard work, for example. You can be working incredibly hard and loving it. And likewise, you can be out of work and incredibly stressed over that. So, and likewise, if you kind of use use that as an analogy for what I was just talking about, if you're out of work, but you're going through, a disciplined approach of, a series of job interviews and so on, and working to remedy that situation, you're going to be a lot less stressed than if you're just worrying about it and doing nothing. Well, I think, one of the things that I think people would be surprised to learn, and I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I suspect it is. And I think that at least at a certain age, the basic foundational things about people are largely set. And so, I'm a lottery winner of a certain kind. And I suspect if you were to go, survey lottery winners, you would find that the core things about them don't really change because they won the lottery. And I think that's probably, and I think people are always very curious about that. How does it fundamentally change a person when they win a lottery? And I don't think it does very much. One thing I find very motivating, and and I think this is probably a very common form of motivation or motive or cause of motivation, is I love people counting on me. And so, today it's so easy to be motivated because we have millions of customers counting on us at Amazon.com. We've got thousands of investors counting on us. And we've got, we're a team of thousands of employees all counting on each other. And so it's, and that's fun. Do something you're very passionate about, and don't try to chase what is kind of the hot passion of the day. I think we actually saw this, I think you see it all over the place in many different contexts, but I think we saw it in the internet world quite a bit, where, at the sort of peak of the sort of internet, mania in, say, 1999, you found people who were very passionate about something. They kind of left that job and decided, I'm going to, do something in the internet because it's, it was almost like the 1849 gold rush in a way. I mean, you find that people, if you go back and study the history of the 1849 gold rush, you find that, at that time, everybody who was within shouting distance of California was, they might have been a doctor, but they quit being a doctor and they started panning for gold. And that almost never works. And even if it does work, according to some metric, financial success or whatever it might be, I suspect it leaves you ultimately unsatisfied. So you really need to be very clear with yourself. And I think one of the best ways to do that is this notion of projecting yourself forward to age 80, looking back on your life and trying to make sure you've minimized the number of regrets you have. That works for career decisions. It works for family decisions. Do you want? I have a 14-month-old son, and it's very easy for me to, if I think about myself when I'm 80, I know I want to watch that little guy grow up. And so I don't want to be 80 and think, shoot, I missed that whole thing, and I don't have the kind of relationship with my son that I wished I had, and so on and so on. So if you think about that, so I guess another thing that I would recommend to people is that they always take a long-term point of view. And I think this is something about which there's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of people, and I'm just not one of them, believe that you should live for the now. I think what you do is you think about the great expanse of time ahead of you and try to make sure that you're planning for that in a way that's going to leave you ultimately satisfied. So this is just this is the way it works for me. And I mean, everybody needs to find that for themselves. So I think there are a lot of paths to satisfaction, and you need to find one that works for you. If you are a lottery winner, as I am, then one of the things that you get a chance to do at some point in your life is to be a philanthropist. And so I didn't grow up hoping, boy, maybe I'll be a philanthropist one day. That wasn't ever on my list of, archaeologist, astronaut, those things I wanted to be. Physicist, I never I think in large part because I never expected to have the means to be a philanthropist. But I think that if you win a lottery of this kind of size, that one of the things that over time you have an obligation to do is to think about the ways that wealth can be used in a highly leveraged way. I also think, by the way, it's really easy to give away money in highly unleveraged ways where it's just a waste of money. And I suspect that it takes as much sort of time, energy, focus, and hard work to effectively give away money as it does to get it in the first place. I think one of the things that's most important to me is, one of the notions that the United States was founded on, and that is liberty. So it's a very difficult thing. I mean, there's lots of very interesting stuff to think about in this regard, and it just so happens that a free market economy, sort of a capitalist system, which has a lot of liberty mixed in with it, that we all get to decide, how we're going to go about making our own living and so on and so on. That happens to also be a very effective way of deploying an economy, so that you get an economy which mostly makes sense. Things mysteriously, because of that invisible hand, tend to work out. I remember there was a time, I may have these statistics slightly wrong, that a few years ago there was a heat wave in the South that killed 3% of chickens. And I think egg prices doubled because there were 3% fewer chickens. So that means that the number of chickens is roughly right, even though there's nobody deciding how many chickens there should be. All right, so that is a very interesting fact, I think, that a free market economy, which by necessity involves a lot of liberty, just happens to work well in terms of allocating resources. But imagine a different world. Imagine a world where some incredibly artificially intelligent computer could actually do a better job than the invisible hand of allocating resources, and were to say, there shouldn't be this many chickens, there should be this many chickens, just a few more or a few less. Well, that might even lead to more aggregate wealth. So it might be a society that if you give up liberty, everybody could be a little wealthier. Now, the question that I would pose is, if that turned out to be the world, is that a good trade? Personally, I don't think so. Personally, I think it'd be a terrible trade. And I sometimes worry about that, because I think it's a coincidence that that liberty tends to do such a good job of sort of creating an economy that functions well. If you look over long periods of time, look over hundreds of years, and look at the average sort of life cycle of a new technology, what you find is that it's getting compressed and compressed and compressed. So the rate of change is getting faster and faster. Every decade that goes by, there are sort of more important discoveries per unit time than there were in the previous decade. And a lot of these discoveries tend to have two uses. I mean, technologies tend to be agnostic with respect to whether they can be used for good or used for evil. And I think that over the next 50 years, we are going to face a lot of very tough decisions as a society in how we make sure that we are harnessing those technologies for good purposes. I think liberty, giving people the freedom to, as long as they're not hurting somebody else, do what they want, is super important. I think it's the core essence of the American dream, and I think at times we as a people get confused about it. I mean, I think one of the things that you see come up in various places, and people talk about it under different labels. Sometimes they talk about it as a lack of personal responsibility and other kinds of labels. But what it really is I think people should carefully reread the first part of the Declaration of Independence, because I think sometimes we as a society start to get confused and think that we have a right to happiness. But if you read the Declaration of Independence, it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nobody has a right to happiness. You should have a right to pursue it, and I think the core of that is liberty.
For Space Training Camp will mark my 7th year participating in Museum of Flight summer camps. I've been to them enough to know that I like to do either communications or data for the simulated space missions we do every year. The opening of the new Apollo exhibit is very exciting. The recovery of the engines from the rocket that sent humans to the moon is a very impressive achievement, and seeing the engines really shows what humans are capable of when they put their minds to it. Watching those rockets blast off to the moon as a boy inspired our special guest to pursue a career in technology. The memory of them led him to support the search for these engines. Now his company, Blue Origin, is building rockets that will continue the story of human space travel, putting astronauts into space on the New Shepard rocket in the next year or so, and hopefully inspiring others like me to dream about sending humans to the other worlds. And the good news is they won't have to go looking for those Blue Origin rocket engines. They land them back at the launch site. You may recognize our guest as the founder of Amazon and the owner of the Washington Post. He's also a philanthropist who has supported the fight against cancer, neuroscience research, and the construction of a clock designed to last 10,000 years. But I think of him as the person who introduced me to my friend, Alexa, who reads me bedtime stories. It is my pleasure to introduce Jeff Bezos.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to open up to questions really quickly here, but before I do that, there's somebody super important in this audience that I need to introduce. His name is David. David, say hello. Raise your hand. Make sure everybody can see you. David is the guy, you saw him on the video briefly, but David is the guy who did all the hard work of putting this expedition together to recover these engines. And let me tell you, anything of this magnitude, actually any important achievement that you can think of and pursue in life, it's going to turn out to be teamwork, and this was certainly no exception. So being able to build teams and work as part of teams turns out to be an incredible life skill, and one that all of you are already probably learning and will continue to learn throughout your lives. Just a couple of things behind me. This is the F1 injector. This was one of the hardest elements of the F1 engine to develop. So back in the 1960s, when they were developing this engine, they didn't know how to stop what's called combustion instability, and that's what these baffles are. So you can see this kind of geometric objects sticking out. That's to stop the kind of acoustic energy inside the combustion chamber from reflecting off of the walls and going around and setting up certain resonant patterns. It's a phenomenon a little bit like, when you sometimes get a microphone too close to the speaker, you get that high-pitched squeal. That's a kind of feedback loop that you don't want. It sets up a resonant frequency. And the same thing can happen inside a combustion chamber, but the energies are so intense that when that happens in a combustion chamber, it just quickly destroys the entire chamber. And in fact, when they developed the F1 engine, they blew up so many engines, and they were just incredibly persistent on the test stand. Over and over and over, they would fail, but they persisted. And that's another thing that is so important in life. It's just that persistence and pushing through failure. That they succeeded though. So after they blew up all these engines on the test stand, they finally perfected this incredible object, and you get to see an unflown F1 engine. There are not very many of these, and the museum here is very fortunate to have gotten one from NASA. When they finally perfected this, 65 of these engines flew, and there was not a single failure. So that's the result of all of that persistence and hard work from those engineers back in the 1960s. This is a great engine, but we're working today, I started a company called Blue Origin, and we're working today to make a better engine. It's not going to be as big. It's about a third the size in terms of thrust, a little more than a third. But it has one capability that this engine, one important capability that this engine was never designed to have, and that it's reusable. This engine was designed to be used once and then thrown away into the ocean. And you can never lower the cost of space travel if you are taking that approach. And so that's why we were able to recover these objects, because they were thrown into the ocean more than 4 decades ago, where they rested on the bottom of the Atlantic under 14,000 feet of water. So that's the thrust chamber, and you can sort of see, you can kind of match this piece up to that. If you see that kind of waffle pattern there, you see where it goes right there. Heat exchanger, turbo pump, the injector. There's a lot of interesting parts over here. This is, I guess, part of the turbine. Very cool. So anyway, hopefully you guys will get a chance to go and look at these things a little closer. And with that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Good. This is one of the great things about kids. There are always questions. I love it. So it's very inspiring. Go ahead, right here in the front. Oh, you have the microphone for you.
How old are you?
I'm 53. 53.
Was it in a trench?
No, we're not in a trench, really. The ocean there was pretty flat, but they did dig themselves in. They're heavy objects, and when they hit the ocean floor there is quite soft. It's kind of like mud and silt. And so when they hit the ocean floor, they buried themselves. We had to spend a lot of time using dredging equipment to remove all of the mud from around the engines so that we could pull them out. How about right here? Oh, right here. Sorry. Great. I'll follow you. You got the mic.
When you were 4, you took apart your crib as a toddler. Have you always been that independent?
What's that?
Have you always been that independent?
I've always been focused. When I was in Montessori school, the Montessori school teacher told my mom that I wouldn't switch tasks, and they got me to switch tasks by picking me up, including my chair, and just moving me to the new task station. I've gotten a little better about that over the years, but it's still, task switching is still a problem for me. Where did the mic go? Right here. Go ahead, please.
Which crew did that go on?
This one never flew. So that's a very good question. The question is, which crew did this engine go on? This engine is unflown. So they made some spare engines that never got used. This is one of those spare engines that never got used. Very good question. Thank you.
Where do you see space travel going next?
Space travel, I want to see millions of people living and working in space. The current global record for astronauts in space simultaneously is 13, and that doesn't happen very often. There have never been more than 13 people in space at the same time. And the problem, of course, is that it's just so expensive. And so we need to figure out how to lower the cost of space travel. And if we can lower the cost of space travel, then there'll be a lot more things that you can do in space. And that, in my opinion, the incredible opportunity is reusability. If you can, the analogy for you would be, how expensive would airplane travel be if you could only use each airplane once? So you fly somewhere and then you have to throw the airplane away. It would be very expensive. Even driving, if you drove somewhere and then had to throw the car away, how expensive would driving be? And so what we really need is operational, realistic, practical, pragmatic reusability, just like you see with commercial aviation. That's the key. If we could do that, we'll dramatically lower the cost of getting people into space.
Is there still parts of rockets down in the ocean, or have you got
A lot. No, we left a lot there. There are 65 of these engines flew, and they all landed in a kind of in an area, maybe a couple hundred square miles of ocean, sort of 10 by 20 miles, sort of an ellipse out there. They're all pretty close to each other, and they're there for future expeditions to go and retrieve them or to leave them there. We wanted to retrieve some of them. We especially wanted to get an Apollo 11 engine, and we wanted to do that before eventually the ocean will corrode those objects and they'll just dissolve into the ocean water. And you can see when you come look at this, the injector and some of these other parts, that process was well underway after 4 decades at 14,000 feet. The water pressure at 14,000 feet is 7,000 pounds per square inch. And so salt and other corrosive things that are in the ocean get into every nook and cranny. And that's why it took so long, by the way, to conserve these objects. When we brought them up, we had to keep them wet at all times. And then some specialists basically carefully disassembled them, cleaned them really well to get rid of all the salt residue and everything else corrosive, and then reassembled them painstakingly. But there's lots down there, and not just F1 engines. There's a lot of space debris. We're still adding to it, because most of the rockets flown today are still, the booster stage is still expendable. And so those things are still going into the ocean quite routinely. Please.
Are you planning on removing the space junk orbiting Earth?
Oh, this is a very interesting question. So for those of you who don't know this, one of the things that happens as we orbit satellites and other things is sometimes there are accidents and you end up with space debris in orbit. And depending on the orbit, it can last up there for a long time. And if you get too much of it, it could make space travel very difficult because you have to dodge all of that debris. It's moving very fast. And if your space vehicle gets hit by any of that debris, it's very likely it would puncture it and cause all kinds of problems. And it's bad for satellites and other things. Nobody currently has any good plans. There are a lot of ideas, but nobody currently has any good plans for removing that space debris. There's people do a lot of activities to keep it from occurring in the first place. So, for example, when you have satellites, you have to either, there are international rules about satellites, and you either have to deorbit them, you have to preserve enough fuel at the end of the satellite's life to either deorbit the satellite or to boost it into a very high orbit where if you get high enough, the orbits really never decay. The reason the orbits decay and these objects fall, if it's low enough, they impact little air molecules in space and they will eventually fall into the ocean, which is fine. And if they're high enough, they will just stay up there forever, and that's also fine. They won't turn into debris. They won't collide with each other. Please.
Did all those parts over there get mangled because of the water pressure or something else?
We believe that most of that damage was done on impact with the ocean's surface. So when the vehicle hit the ocean surface, it was moving very fast. It fell from 40 miles and then hit the ocean surface very hard. And it was not, even though this engine is designed to take extraordinary loads, it generates 1.5 million pounds of thrust, all of which is reacted through a little gimbal up at the top. But it's really designed to take all of that load from a very specific direction. And of course, when it hit the ocean, it took all of those forces from what were effectively random directions. So we think, although we're probably not really sure, that most of this damage being ripped apart was done by impact with the ocean surface. And then there's also a second kind of damage, which is all the corrosion. When you look at it close, you can see that very easily.
Did the spaceship did it fall into the water?
Yes.
And sink?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So basically, the Saturn V is a 3-stage vehicle, and the first 2 stages fell into oceans. And then the 3rd stage, different things happened to it. But I think there's a Saturn V 3rd stage that it kind of came back into Earth vicinity. They're kind of floating around out there.
Did you know you wanted to do this when you were a kid?
Yes. Well, not this particular expedition, but it was a very good question. Ever since I was 5 years old, that's when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon. I've been kind of passionate about space, rockets, rocket engines, space travel. I became a science fiction reader, And I've always known that I wanted to, do something having to do with space, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it for really almost my whole life. And that's one of the things. You guys will find that you have passions, and having a passion is a gift. I think we all have passions, and you don't get to choose them. They pick you, but you have to be alert to them. You have to be looking for them. And when you find your passion, it's a fantastic gift for you because it gives you direction, it gives you purpose. You can have a job, or you can have a career, or you can have a calling. And the best thing is to have a calling. And if you find your passion, you'll have that, and all your work won't feel like work to you.
Did you see any new species?
No, we did see some marine life on the bottom of the ocean floor down there at 14,000 feet, but not as much as you might think. Down at that depth, there isn't there's not a lot of marine life.
What do you think artificial intelligence has in store for the future of space exploration?
Oh, what a good question. Well, one of the things that artificial intelligence has in store for the future of space exploration, I believe, is just ever better robotic probes to explore the solar system. So one of the things that happens, if you look at, for example, at the Martian rovers today, they drive very, very slowly. You have to be extraordinarily careful. The speed of light is actually a limiter on communicate. You can't really operate them remotely very well because depending on how far away Mars is from Earth at that particular time, it takes many minutes for the light to travel from Earth to Mars, and so that's, you can send instructions, but you have to wait a long time to see the results of those instructions, and so that's one of the reasons that you get to cover very little ground with those rovers. You don't want to, you spend so much money to get the rover soft landed onto the surface of Mars. The last thing you want to do is get it stuck in a ditch. So they're extraordinarily planful. But if you had really good, kind of self-driving technology, machine vision and other things, those rovers could keep themselves safe, and they could go faster and explore much more in a given amount of time. And I think that's just one example. I'm using Mars as an example, but that would be true of all of the robotic probes that we send throughout the solar system. And that's a really good way to do that. I would say another thing is, I think we should build a permanent human settlement on one of the poles of the moon. And it's time to go back to the moon, but this time to stay. And there you would want to pre-position a whole bunch of equipment and supplies before the humans show up. And some of those things might need to be assembled on the surface of the moon. And that's the kind of thing that could also be done by advanced robotics with machine learning systems on board.
My question is, what do you see for the future of Blue Origin?
Well, so for Blue Origin, we're working on two vehicles right now. One is called New Shepard. It's a suborbital tourism vehicle. It's named after the first American in space. His name was Alan Shepard. We're working on a second vehicle, which is called New Glenn. It's named after John Glenn, the first American in orbit. And New Glenn is a very large vehicle. It uses 7 of the BE-4 engines for about 3.85 million pounds of thrust. You can think of it as, in terms of thrust, being about half the size of a Saturn V. And that vehicle will fly in 2020 for the first time. We've been working on it for 5 years already. We launched Pad 36 at Cape Canaveral, so it'll fly from there. And the booster stage of that vehicle is reusable. And so it's designed from the very beginning to be reusable. So that's, and the New Shepard vehicle also is designed to be reusable. So again, that's our whole approach, is to focus on lowering the cost, and that is about reusability, in my opinion.
So in your life, what obstacles did you face before you achieved success? Did positivity help you in some ways, and how did you come up with the solution?
Wow, that's a good philosophical question. We all have adversity in our lives. I doubt if you really, if you know somebody, any friend or anybody that you talk to, there's no lack of adversity. And by the way, that's good, because it's what teaches us how to get back up. You fall down, you get back up. It always happens. And you get certain gifts in life and you want to take advantage of those. But I guess my advice on adversity and success would be to be proud not of your gifts, but of your hard work and your choices. So, you may be, the kinds of gifts you get in life, you might be really good at math. It might be really easy for you. That's a kind of gift. But practicing that math and taking it to the next step, that could be very challenging and hard and take a lot of sweat. That's a choice. You can't really be proud of your gifts because they were given to you. You can be grateful for them and thankful for them. But your choices, you choose to work hard. You choose to do hard things. Those are choices that you can be proud of.
My question is, what is one thing that you wish the space exploration had?
One thing I wish that space exploration had, is that the question? I just make sure I heard you right. There are a bunch of ways to answer that question, but for me, what I would really like to see, if I could wave a magic wand, I wish that there could be, a bunch of very entrepreneurial startup companies doing amazing things in space. Because I think if you had thousands of startup companies, sort of like what we've seen on the internet over the last 20 years. You look on the internet, there are all these startups, and some of them turned into big companies like Facebook and Snapchat and so on and so on. A lot of them didn't work out. But you got incredible, kind of entrepreneurial dynamism. Every experiment got tried. And the reason that could happen is that it doesn't cost very much. The price of admission of getting started on the internet, Facebook got started in a dorm room, and to do incredible things in space today, the price of admission, the price of getting started is just way too high. To do anything super interesting in space is an expensive proposition. And we need to lower that price of admission. So that's what I would really love to see. I would love to see thousands of companies. And I think, by the way, this is your generation. You guys and people your age are the ones who are going to benefit from reusable rockets. You're the ones who are going to come up with those creative entrepreneurial ideas in space. Because we're working to lower that cost. So we'll be ready for you and your children and your grandchildren.
Is there any way that you know of that will reduce the price of rocket fuel to go into space?
This is a very good question. And here's the thing that you really need to know is that the rocket fuel is already not a very expensive part of what's happening. So I'll give you New Glenn as an example. New Glenn carries a few million pounds of rocket propellant, liquid oxygen and liquefied natural gas. The total, and a launch of that scale today, there are only a couple of vehicles of that size that fly, and they are well north of $100 million per launch. And so the cost is more than $100 million to launch that vehicle. And the cost of the propellants is only $600,000. So liquid oxygen only costs 10 cents a pound. And so, 1 million pounds of liquid oxygen only costs $100,000. And we only have a few million pounds of propellants on board. And liquefied natural gas is not that much more expensive than liquid oxygen. And so the cost of propellants is really not the problem. The real problem is that you have this exquisite aerospace grade hardware that so many people work so hard to build and perfect and test, and then you use it once and throw it away.
How you think tourism will affect the spaceflight industry?
A very good question. I like tourism as a mission for spaceflight because the frequency of it can be very high. So you can do a lot of it. And one of the things that we know is we humans get better at everything that we practice. And today, the most used launch vehicles only fly maybe a dozen times a year. And you just never get truly great at anything that you do only a dozen times a year. And so if we could fly 50 times a year, 100 times a year, ultimately 1,000 times a year, we'd be getting so much more practice. And tourism is one of those missions that might do that. And there is a long history of tourism and entertainment driving technological advancement. I'll give you a couple of examples. In aviation, early days of aviation, one of the only practical applications of early airplanes was barnstorming. And so the pilot would fly into a farmer's field somewhere and sell tickets and take people up on joyrides. And that's because planes really weren't that capable, and so there wasn't a lot that they could do that was practical, but people liked to fly. And so that lets you start to practice and start to improve and start to get better. Another one, much more recent, is that some of the advances that we're seeing today in machine learning and in artificial intelligence are being driven by GPUs, which is a special kind of processor, computer processor. And why were GPUs invented? For one purpose and one purpose only. They were invented by NVIDIA for playing video games. And so then people, they were graphics accelerators, and so this invention that was invented by, perfected for, and improvements driven by video games is now at the heart of doing artificial intelligence computations. That's another example. Who has the mic?
Underwater, did you see any ships?
No, we did not see. We did see a few other things. Mostly we found only rocket engines underwater. We didn't find any ships, but we did see like a Pepsi can, and everything shows up because it's mostly just mud, and so you can spot shiny objects pretty easily when you're down with the cameras. So we saw little bits of debris here and there, but we really didn't see anything like a shipwreck or anything like that. That would have been cool though.
Are you exploring anything new now?
Not really. I mean, if you're thinking about this kind of underwater exploration, no, I'm putting all of my pioneer exploration energy into Blue Origin. So I think it's really important that we build a 21st century version of this engine. And we have the technology today to do it better. As great as this engine was, it wasn't reusable. It actually is kind of a medium performing engine. Even though the thrust is very high, 1.5 million pounds of thrust, the figure of merit for the performance of a rocket engine is something called specific impulse, and this is sort of a medium performing engine. Today we can build a 21st century version. Of course we should be able to do better, it's 50 years later. What these guys did with the tools and technologies that they had available to them at the time is nothing short of a miracle.
What space are you talking about? The space on a computer or the space like the solar system?
I'm talking mostly about space like the solar system, although I'm also very interested in cyberspace, which is the space on a computer. I'm interested in both. Both are super interesting fields.
What motivated or inspired you when times are rough?
Say that again, I couldn't hear you.
What motivated or inspired you when times are rough?
When times are rough, what motivates me when times are rough? You know, I find if I'm stressed about something, it's usually because I'm not doing anything about it. And so if I'm stressed about something, I'm trying to figure out, why am I stressed? I'm listening to my body as a signal that something is awry. And then I find that the stress goes away the second I take the first step of identify the source of the stress. Why am I stressed about this? What's going on? And then, talk to somebody about it. Find allies. I would say that if you can find friends who are interested in similar things or want to help you solve a problem, problem solving is inspiring for me all by itself. As long as I have allies, there's nothing more fun than getting in a room with a group of inventors and saying, look, here's the problem. Let's invent a solution to it. And as soon as you start doing that, I find that it turns from something that might create stress into something that creates fun.
How did you make all these rockets?
Well, again, that is a team effort. There are about 1,000 people who work at Blue Origin and growing. And this is not, you cannot do this kind of endeavor by yourself. It just isn't practical. It's not possible. In the movie version of this, it's kind of the Tony Stark movie version of this. He he goes into his basement by himself and builds all of these incredible robotic suits that can fly and so on. In real life, you have to work as part of a team to build incredible things, and so that's what's going on. The answer to your question is with a lot of help.
How did the Sputnik orbit Earth?
Oh, what a good question. Well, Sputnik is a super famous satellite. Sounds like you know something about it. And Sputnik started the space race back in the 1960s. The Soviet Union was the first country to launch an artificial satellite around the Earth. It was called Sputnik. It was a very simple satellite, but it was an incredible accomplishment. What's that?
It was launched from the Soyuz.
That's right. It was launched from the Soyuz. Somebody has been doing their homework. Very good. And the I already got the high five for that. It's a and so it basically threw kind of the U.S. military establishment and the government into a bit of a panic, because the question was, well, if the Soviet Union can do this and they're so far ahead of us in space, what else can they do? And so that kind of led to what ultimately became the Apollo program. In fact, the reason that setting a man on the moon was chosen as the goal was because it was so difficult and so far in the future that it gave us a chance to catch up. And that's what led to the Apollo 11 lunar mission.
What company manufactures Blue Origin's rockets?
We do. So Blue Origin manufactures their own rockets, and we've built our own test stands. We have all of our own milling machines, and so we bring in raw materials, and raw materials come in one side of the factory, and rocket engines come out the other. We've built 4 rocket engines now. The BE-3 is in flight. That's our liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen rocket engine. It's 110,000 pounds of thrust. That's the engine that's on the booster stage of the New Shepard vehicle. It's also going to be on the 3rd stage of the New Glenn, of the 3-stage variant of the New Glenn vehicle.
When Apollo 13 failed this mission, how did it come back to Earth?
Oh, so the Apollo 13, so first of all, the launch was successful on Apollo 13. So they were already on their way to the moon before they had a problem. So they were in their little capsule and headed to the moon, which it takes about 3 days or so to get to the moon, and 3 days to get back. And once you're on your way, you can't turn around and come back. The only way, you have to finish the mission. And so you don't have to land on the moon, but you can use the moon's gravity to do a kind of figure 8 swing by the moon, and then it send you, if you time everything just right, send you back towards Earth. And that's what they did on Apollo 13. So they aborted the lunar landing, and they used the moon's gravity to reverse their direction, and they came back to Earth. But they had to solve a lot of problems because they didn't have a lot of battery power. They didn't have a lot of. I got to talk one time to Jim Lovell, and I asked him if there was anything. He was one of the guys on the Apollo 13 mission. If there was anything that he didn't like about the Apollo 13 movie, because the Apollo 13 movie is a fantastic movie. If you guys haven't watched it, you should definitely watch it. It's very exciting and very fun. And he was an advisor on that movie. And he said to me that the only thing he didn't like, and none of the crew members like this one thing, is that in the movie, they show them arguing with each other because of the stress. So they're on this mission, it's a life or death situation, and these professional astronauts are arguing with each other. And he's like, that never happened. It would never happen. And he said, he brought it up with Ron Howard, who is the director of the film, and Ron said, Jim, I know, but look, it's a movie, and we have to have stress. And it can't just be like one little drop of sweat on your head. It has to be more obvious. So they changed that, and it's not real to life, but it's still that movie in many ways is very accurate.
Do you have any ties with NASA?
Yes, we do. Blue Origin does have ties with NASA. I also got NASA's permission to recover these engines. They still belong to NASA, even though they've been on the bottom of the ocean floor for more than 4 decades. They're still owned by NASA. They gave me permission to recover the engines, but Blue Origin does some things with NASA as well. And we also propose things to NASA from time to time. So, for example, we have proposed to NASA this idea of returning to the moon, and we would like to set up a cargo service for that. So it's kind of like, we call the program Blue Moon, and we have an architecture and some technologies that allow us to soft land large amounts of mass on the surface of the moon, which would be necessary if you were going to build a permanent human settlement there.
My question is, what do you see in the future of oxygenators or bringing oxygen to other planets so that the space missions can last longer?
Wow. You've hit on something that's really important. If you want to live in space for long periods of time and do so cost effectively, you have to use the resources that you find in space. And so one of the exciting things, you can't just bring everything with you. You can do that if you're going to go for a few days or maybe even a few months. But if you really want to turn it into like a permanent settlement, you want to be able to live off the land a little bit, just like early pioneers did when they came to the New World and other places. And so one of the things that's very exciting about the poles of the moon as a place to go is that just in the last 10 years, we have learned that there is water ice on the moon. This was always thought to be impossible because water, whenever the sun, when sunlight hits, if sunlight were to hit ice on the moon, it would heat up, it would turn to a vapor because of the vacuum, and then because the moon's gravity is so low, it would actually escape over time from the surface of the moon. It would just kind of evaporate out into space. And so the moon is a very dry place in general. But what we now know is that in certain craters on the poles of the moon, the North Pole and the South Pole of the moon, they are in permanent shadow. The sun never reaches to the bottoms of those craters. And as a result, we now know that there are a bunch of volatiles like ice water frozen in those permanently shadowed regions. And so once you have water, you can make oxygen. So you can use electrolysis to split water up into hydrogen and oxygen. And the oxygen obviously is super useful, and so you can use it, and so is the hydrogen. You can use them as rocket propellants if you want. You can breathe the oxygen. That's a very important discovery that we've learned about the moon in just the last decade.
This is a thank you from all of the kids.
Oh my goodness, thank you. Here, let me set this down. Thank you guys. This is very cool, and I had a lot of fun doing this. Your questions are fantastic. Thank you. And you can, I'll leave you with just one quick thing, which is that for a long time, hundreds of years, thousands of years, the idea of going to the moon was so impossible that people actually used it as a metaphor for impossibility. And then, in the 1960s, we humans did it. And what I would hope you would take away from that is that anything you set your mind to, you can do. Von Braun said after the lunar landing, I have learned to use the word impossible with great caution. And I hope you guys take that attitude about your lives.